Thank you. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is an organizer with Global Justice for Animals and the Environment, GJAE, an organization addressing the threat posed by free trade agreements to animals, the environment, safe, ethical, and sustainable food, and the human rights of the environmental defenders. He also represents GJAE in Trade Justice New York Metro, a coalition of organizations from diverse social movements working together to resist the NAFTA model of trade deals for the 1%. To put it in other words, ladies and gentlemen, he is a stalwart combatant against TPP and other such horrible trade agreements. So how about a big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for a man who's in the trenches every day, Adam Weissman.
The problem is capitalism, not cruelty. In fighting the meat industry, it's critical that we understand our enemy. And so we need to understand that factory farming doesn't happen because Frank Perdue woke up one morning and said, "Gosh, I really hate chickens." The global factory farm economy is a direct response to market imperatives. Factory farming developed along the lines of capitalist mass production, increasing production volume, driving down costs, a model of ever expanding market growth, cheaper products, and increasing profits by driving up consumption. Factory farming is an economic reality, and that's what we need to understand in fighting this industry. By treating chickens as egg production units and driving down the cost to produce an egg as cheaply as possible, by treating the bodies of animals as living meat machines, and at the expense of animals, welfare, at the expense of the treatment of workers, at the expense of our environment, producing at the highest volume possible, using minimal space, minimal economic inputs to produce maximum product. The global factory farm industry has been able to massively expand meat production, has been able to massively expand the availability of meat, and has been able to produce a cheaper product that has facilitated the vast growth of animal consumption within the last century. And this has been enormously profitable for them, which is why they do it. Now, the meat industry has run into two problems. One of them is that people do not like it when you pollute their waterways, people do not like it when you poison their food, and people do not like it when they find out that animals were tortured for the food on their plates. And the result, often, is regulation. And for the meat industry, that's bad news. Again, not because they want to pollute the water, not because they hate animals, not because they really want to make people sick, but because producing as cheaply and dirtily and as exploitatively as possible is economically beneficial to them. It keeps their costs down. So the meat industry, in response to this problem of regulation, has found a great workaround, and that's offshoring production. If they can't produce, if Smithfield Foods can't produce in Maryland without having to answer to minimal environmental regulations, then they will just move production to a country where those regulations don't exist, like Mexico. But there's a problem there, which is tariffs, because when they move production overseas and then try to bring products back, there are taxes put on those imports, and that minimizes some of the economic advantage of moving things overseas. Well, they fixed that problem. Smithfield Foods was one of the direct beneficiaries of something called the North American Free Trade Agreement that I imagine a few of you have heard of, NAFTA. Shortly after the passage of NAFTA, Smithfield located a massive factory farm in Veracruz, Mexico, where they could escape the minimal regulations that they had to face in the United States. One of the outcomes of that was incubating swine flu, leading to the death of 18,000 people. The meat industry's response was not to say, well, we need to clean up our act and we need to really reconsider the global factory farm economy. The meat industry's response was to say, we have a PR problem. And so quickly, swine flu stopped being called swine flu and started being called H1N1. And then they said, well, gee, people are getting worried about pink slime. People are wanting to know more about where their food is produced. People are wanting to know about what regulations are in place on the food that they produce. People are doing things like passing ballot initiatives against gestation crates and against battery cages. So if we're producing stuff in Mexico and people can know that, that might not be so good for us if Mexican regulations or wherever we're producing aren't as strong as the regulations that people are working to pass in the US. But right on all those meat products, there's a label that says made in whatever country it's made in. There's country of origin labeling on those meat products. So that actually works against our advantage because we may be able to produce more cheaply, but if there's less demand for those products because people don't want to buy products that are less regulated, then we're going to lose out in terms of demand and consumption and profits. So the meat industry had a solution to that too. So the meat industry, through the Mexican and Canadian governments, went to the World Trade Organization and said that the U.S. country of origin labeling on meat is a barrier to trade for Mexican and Canadian meat exports. And the World Trade Organization said, well, Canada and Mexico, you're right. The U.S. is violating your rights to trade through this country of origin labeling on meat. So that rule is illegal. So as of this year, the U.S. has now eliminated country of origin labeling on meat, which means that any time someone passes a ban on gestation crates, that any time someone passes a ban on battery cages, that any time there's a new consumer protection rule, a new environmental rule that drives up costs for the meat industry has a very good incentive to just move to a country where those regulations don't exist. Now, some of you may be saying, well, hell with it. I don't think these regulations are the solution anyway. We should just get rid of this industry altogether. And I want you to think about that for a second. Because again, the reason the meat industry opposes these regulations is not because they like pollution or animal cruelty or making people sick. The reason they do it is because it pushes down their costs, which pushes up their sales, which means more people eating more animals. So if we want less people eating animals, if we want their costs to go up, if we want to economically sabotage their industry, then regulating the hell out of them is in our interest. Not because we think banning battery cages are the solution, but because we do want to get rid of these industries, which means we want to make it as costly as possible for them to exist. They profit off of suffering, they profit off of pollution, they profit off of making people sick, and we should make that difficult for them at every possible turn. So the meat industry has one other problem in addition to regulation, and that's the fact that we're all here. That's the fact that for decades people have been getting out the message that animal agriculture means suffering, means waste of resources, means pollution, means damaging people's health. And the result is that in the United States, meat consumption is flat. And if you remember, I said before, the imperative of this industry is infinite growth. It's not acceptable to have stagnant rates of consumption. It's not acceptable to have consumption decreasing. They need to continually up consumption. So how do you do that when people aren't eating more meat and people aren't going to eat more meat? Well, you look to the global market. You look to expand consumption worldwide. You look to where you're not already exporting products, where people aren't eating as much meat, or people are eating meat that's produced on smaller family farms in lower volume. And you look to expand your markets everywhere. But there are some barriers to doing that. There are things like tariffs that protect family farms against industrially produced government-subsidized factory farm products. There are things like environment. There are things like import regulations on products produced through animal suffering. There are things like food safety rules, like for example, Europe's very reasonable position that they don't want to import meat from animals that are fed bovine growth hormone, and they don't want poultry that's been treated with chlorine, or Taiwan's regulation against pork from animals that have been fed ractopamine, which is a livestock additive that was originally developed as an asthma medication. Wasn't good for that, but they figured out that if you feed this stuff to livestock, it promotes rapid lean growth. It also causes suffering to the animals and disease. It also causes disease to the people who eat those animals, which is why ractopamine is banned in 160 countries, but is legal in the US. So the solution, as far as the meat industry sees it, is not to say, well, gee, maybe it's a good idea to not use this stuff. The solution, as far as the meat industry is concerned, is to push for a global race to the bottom, to get rid of everyone's standards, to get rid of the environmental rules, to get rid of the tariffs, so that they can produce meat where it's cheap as possible, with the most abused workers, with the most blatant union busting, with the most exploited animals, with the least environmental rules, and produce in massive volume and get the whole world addicted to factory farm poison at the expense of the future of our planet. So how are they going to do this when all these regulations are in place? Well, that brings us to two new gleams in the eyes of the meat industry. One is called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the other is called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. These are two massive free trade deals that the meat industry has been heavily lobbying for. The TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is a trade deal with 40% of the global economy. It is the largest trade deal in history. It was signed in February, but cannot go into effect until it is voted on by Congress. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership is an agreement between the U.S. and the entire European Union that is, as far as the meat industry is concerned, largely a response to the fact that European activists have actually made progress in passing laws against some of the worst abuses of the factory farm industry. The pork industry has said that they specifically want to ensure that those rules are left out of any agreement, that they can access those markets, and that regulations are left to science-based standards, which means animal suffering is not a consideration on the table. Well, the good news is that activists have been fighting back, and Congress has been listening. Just last week, 19 members of the New York congressional delegation signed a letter to President Obama saying, hell no, we are not voting for TPP. And while the corporations have been coming together, because it's not just the meat industry that wants this agreement, it's also the companies like Nike and Walmart that want to sell hyper-exploitative sweatshop-made products produced by exploited labor in Vietnam. It's also the corporations that want, like Pfizer, that want to expand intellectual property rules over life-saving medicines so that they can basically kill people desperately in need of medications just so that they can keep their profit margins up on brand-name pharmaceuticals. While the big corporations have been uniting, what's also been happening is that the environmentalists, the labor rights activists, the anti-hunger activists, the access to medicine activists, the feminists, this broad spectrum of social movements are coming together and saying, we reject this corporate power grab. We reject TPP and TTIP. So this is an opportunity for us as animal activists who often say we need to come together with other social movements and build bridges to do that in an area that is also an area that is life and death for animals. We can come together with these movements and add our strengths to defeat TPP and TTIP, to shut down this last gasp of the meat industry at a time when there are predictions that of ballooning consumption of animal products in the global south, massive increases in consumption by 2050. It is imperative for global survival that we stop these agreements, that we stop the meat industry's sinister plan to expand globally, to addict the world to factory farming. What can we do to stop this? Well, this Thursday, there's going to be a rally at City Hall with members of Congress announcing their opposition to TPP. We can be there as animal advocates, as opponents of the meat industry, to say that we are joining with these other social movements to say no to TPP. That's Thursday at City Hall. Tonight, if you want to find out more, there will be a webinar on TPP, looking at how its impact on women, with the president of the National Organization for Women. You can go to the Global Justice for Animals and the Environment table that I'm pointing at right over there. There's a no TPP sign to sign a sign-up sheet. and take literature and learn more, this is a fight that we can win. Members of Congress do not want to pass this thing, but they're feeling pressure from the corporations. They need to feel even more pressure from us. We need to tell them that if you want to be reelected, that means committing to vote no against TPP. Let's fight the factory farms. Let's fight the global meat economy. Let's stop the TPP. Thank you.
Adam Weissman, ladies and gentlemen, man who knows what he's talking about. And I do encourage you to visit his table, take some literature, learn more about this issue. The TPP is a dreadful, dreadful thing. It is absolutely imperative that we stop it.